There is a lot in the 165-page brief from Jack Smith's team, but perhaps no portion more relevant to this next 33 days than a conversation a White House aide told investigators he overheard between Donald Trump and his family members, where the former president said the election doesn't matter, the votes don't matter. Quote, "It doesn't matter if you win or lost the election. You have to fight like hell." Joining us now, former RNC chairman and MSNBC political analyst Michael Steele. He is also co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend. Also with us, former campaign manager for Hillary Clinton, Robbie Mook. All right, so Michael, when he says it doesn't matter, you got to fight like hell, what does that mean for 33 days from now, for the next election?
It means buckle up, because you're going to get a reprise of what we saw after the election in 2020. But they're going to be better prepared for it. They have more people in place than they did then. They know where the hot buttons are. They know where to step and where not to step. They've got a legal team that's spread out across the country, including the battleground states. So, everyone has kind of, been sleepwalking since that time, thinking, well, it won't happen. He was not serious. No, Donald Trump wants the presidency. He wants the presidency for power because he wants to be a dictator. He told us that. And he wants the presidency to protect him because of all the things you were talking about before coming into this segment. So unless people really understand that and appreciate what it means to elect him again in November, yeah, he's prepared to throw down and throw down hard. He wants it back. And he wants it back for a reason. It has nothing to do with his followers. He's already told them, I don't need you to vote for me. Don't worry about voting for me, because he knows he's fixing the system. He knows he's putting in place what he needs to disrupt the process and to create enough tension and confusion that you'll have people on the streets protecting and defending him and coming to his aid, while the lawyers and folks like us on TV be sitting here going, what happened?
There are those out there who are Republicans and Donald Trump allies mostly, who are likening this to what James Comey did to the Hillary Clinton campaign in the lead up to the election. Do you see it as the same, Robbie?
Well, first and foremost, on the Clinton campaign, Comey was making an announcement that he was closing an investigation and was choosing not to press charges. In this situation, we have a prosecutor who has pressed charges, was sent back by the judge to re-examine those charges based on Donald Trump's Supreme Court ruling in his favor. And now he's come back with even more information. So the two aren't really alike. And I would say if Trump's team had wanted to hurry up and get this over with before the election, I'm not a lawyer, but they certainly at no juncture have ever taken steps to speed any of this up. I think he likes this. I think he wants this to keep going. He wants to keep this fight alive. And I think Chairman Steele is absolutely right that this is just, not that we needed more evidence, but this is definitely more evidence that this is all about him. This is not about our democracy. This is not about the voters. This is not about the people. This is about him winning an election and taking power.
Let me put up some polling, NBC News polling, on what the most important issues are to voters. And you'll see inflation, the cost of living tops everything. But 19% of voters say threats to democracy matter. I wonder, Robbie, do you see this filing as convincing anybody that they should not vote for Donald Trump? Or the people who are saying that threats to democracy matter, are they already baked in as voters for Kamala Harris?
Yeah, I think they probably, the people who do care most about this probably have made up their mind. I mean, this is year 8 of us hearing about him undermining our democracy. So I don't think there's anything new here. I do think this is a helpful reminder to anybody who might think that, well, Harris is doing fine, maybe I won't vote, or how important really is this election? This is a great reminder that it is incredibly important. But I do think ultimately Harris's path to victory runs through what she can do to improve people's economic situations, to lower the cost of living. And I think that's why you've seen the campaign really lean into that side of the argument rather than litigate what happened on January 6th.
I think one of the most surprising things about this election, perhaps telling, is the absence of Mike Pence. You know, he's not Donald Trump's running mate again. Mike Pence has not come out and said you should vote for Donald Trump. In fact, the opposite. Mike Pence's life was in danger on January 6th, 2021. Donald Trump, we have in this filing, didn't really care about that, according to prosecutors. I wonder, Michael, why that hasn't been a singular issue in this campaign, why that hasn't been a bigger issue for voters who are deciding between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris.
Because I think in large measure, you have minds that go, well, Donald Trump wanted to see him hang, so he is of no relevance in that regard. And then you have those, who are saying, and probably advising him in some way to position himself for 2028, because I don't know why everyone seems to think that 2028 is going to be a brand new landscape for the Republican Party if Donald Trump is not in the White House. I hate to disabuse you of that notion, baby. That's not how that's going to play out. You would think that Pence, given all that he's been involved in with Donald Trump and all that's happened to him, would be more vocal, would be more out there in the public, would be standing with a Liz Cheney, metaphorically speaking, if not actually. But he hasn't. And that's because there are other political calculations that are being made by him and others about what the next 4 years will look like and what the fifth year of the next 4 years will look like for them potentially being a nominee of the Republican Party. They still want to be that standard bearer for a party that no longer exists. And that's going to be the rude awakening for a lot of these folks, whether Donald Trump wins or loses. MAGA now runs this thing. So the battle begins inside the party for what that looks like going forward. And guys like Pence, they don't want to get their hands dirty.
It also makes
it
makes you wonder what J.D. Vance might be willing to do if put in the same position. J.D. Vance, who on the debate stage just a couple nights ago.
Anything and everything. He's willing to do anything and everything if it gets him closer to the power he wants.
Listen, he wouldn't even say that Donald Trump lost the election. Wouldn't even say that definitively, even though that's what happened. Robbie Mook.
Exactly.
Michael Steele, gentlemen, thank you very much.
An extraordinary political moment. The kind that just a few years ago was in the category of hell has frozen over and pigs are flying, category possible. Vice President Kamala Harris will be joined on the campaign trail by none other than Liz Cheney in battleground Wisconsin. Their joint campaign appearance is fraught with symbolism. They'll be speaking in Ripon, Wisconsin, where meetings in a one-room schoolhouse led to the founding of the Republican Party back in the year 1854. NBC News reports this, quote, Harris plans to play into that symbolism by recognizing the founding principles of the Republican Party and pledging to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law. That's according to a senior campaign official. That Harris will be at the birthplace of the GOP together with Liz Cheney, the Democratic presidential nominee and a former Republican congresswoman, a former leader of the House Republican caucus, and the heir to a family whose name is synonymous with what it meant to be a conservative Republican, speaks to the breadth of the coalition that Vice President Kamala Harris has assembled. It is perhaps unprecedented in modern American politics. It is an incredibly large tent that she has assembled in very short order. It includes former Vice President Dick Cheney, as well as self-proclaimed Democratic socialist Senator Bernie Sanders. Of course, that coalition is also made possible by a wannabe autocrat, wants to be dictator on day one, Donald Trump, whose violent coup attempt was a bridge too far for Liz Cheney and so many of the Republicans who now publicly support Vice President Harris. Here's what Cheney said just before the one-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection.
This is a man who has demonstrated that he is at war with the rule of law. He's demonstrated that he's willing to blow through every guardrail of democracy. Any man who would watch television as police officers were being beaten, as his supporters were invading the Capitol of the United States, is clearly unfit for future office, clearly can never be anywhere near the Oval Office ever again.
But unlike Mitch McConnell, who said that Trump's conduct was a disgraceful dereliction of duty, or GOP primary runner-up Nikki Haley, who said Trump, quote, went down a path he shouldn't have and we shouldn't have followed him, and most of the rest of the Republican Party, Liz Cheney has been unwavering in the belief that Donald Trump is unfit for future office, that he would be a threat to the state of our democracy if he ever returned to the White House. The ex-president has done nothing to prove Liz Cheney wrong. In fact, he's done the opposite of that, pledging to pardon the January 6 rioters, to prosecute his political opponents, including Liz Cheney. He's claimed the 2024 election is rigged if he loses fair and square. But if Donald Trump made a Cheney endorsement possible, it is the Harris campaign and Harris herself who sealed the deal. Liz Cheney's threat assessment of Donald Trump, combined with the existence of a viable alternative, an experienced vice president whose views, especially when it comes to America's place in the world, are firmly in the tradition of previous American presidents. Here's how Liz Cheney explained her endorsement of the vice president last month.
You know, I have never viewed this as a policy election.
Right.
But I think that it's a very important point. If you look at Vice President Harris's speech, for example, at the Democratic Convention, it is a speech that Ronald Reagan could have given. It's a speech that George Bush could have given. It's very much an embrace and an understanding of the exceptional nature of this great nation, a love of America, a recognition that America is a special place, a recognition that we all have to work together to ensure that. When it comes to fundamental alliances, when it comes to the importance of NATO, for example, and how important it is for the United States to lead in the world, we've seen a sea change. We now have a Republican Party that is embracing isolationism, that is embracing Putin, that, you know, we've seen just in the last week, the Republican vice presidential nominee willing to appear, willing to be interviewed by Tucker Carlson, who is platforming pro-Nazis, is himself pushing pro-Nazi propaganda. That is not the party of Ronald Reagan. And I believe strongly that if you're talking about a national security set of issues and you care about America's leadership role in the world, a vote for Vice President Harris is the right vote to make this time around.
It's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Political strategist, MSNBC senior analyst Matt Dowd is back with us. Here with me at the table, New York Times editorial board member and MSNBC political analyst Mara Gay is here. And NBC News correspondent Yamiche Alcindor is at the Harris-Cheney event in Ripon, Wisconsin for us. Yamiche, I start with you. Tell me what is unfolding right behind you.
Well, good afternoon, Nicole, from Ripon, Wisconsin, which is the birthplace of the Republican Party. Vice President Harris is going to be here just a few hours from now with Liz Cheney, of course, the former representative that was really pushed out of office by former President Donald Trump because she broke with him on the issue of January 6th, saying that he was a threat to democracy. Now, the thesis for this event is really emblazoned on a big, large billboard that everyone in this area can see, and it says "Country over Party." That is the message that Vice President Harris wants these Republican voters that she's courting here to take away from this. She really wants to underscore that she's reaching out to conservative voters, reaching out to former Trump supporters. I just broke a story that is showing that just in the last few hours, 2 new ads were put out featuring a man named Matthew, who was a former Trump supporter who is now explaining why he's going to be voting for Harris. So that really tells you that this is part of a larger strategy by the Harris campaign to lean into Republican voters. I also want to play for you what I've heard just in walking around Ripon today. I talked to 2 men who have told me that they voted for Republicans in the past. Take a listen to what they told me now.
With the way things went with the last election, the fact that Trump didn't admit that he lost, I would definitely say that I am not for any of that.
I think Trump has destroyed the Republican Party.
How so?
Because it's gone. You have a mega party now. Even the Republicans are leaving the Republican Party.
What do you think of Liz Cheney and Harris coming here together?
I think that's a good sign. So,
A sign of what?
well, it's a good sign that some Republicans are going to vote Democrat, even though they disagree with the policy, you know, because they just can't get on board with Trump.
Now, Nicole, this is a deep red part of Wisconsin, which, of course, is a critical battleground state. And I should tell you, I talked to a number of former Republicans who say they're voting for Vice President Harris, who didn't want to go on camera. So the numbers were bigger than the people who were willing to stand up and say it on national television. So I just want to underscore that there are a lot of people here who say they just do not recognize the Republican Party, especially after January 6th. So this is part of a bigger campaign, as I said, by the Harris campaign to really push out and target Republican voters. And I want to say one other thing, which is, if people are wondering, is this sort of the first of many? It is. We learned that former, of course, GOP chair Liz Cheney, as well as Trump White House aides Alyssa Farah, Cassidy Hutchinson, and Sarah Matthews, they're all going to be getting together next week in Pennsylvania to do a fireside chat. Those are all Republican women who voted for or were working for Donald Trump. We're going to be coming together. So we're going to see more and more of this as the election day gets nearer.
Matt Dowd, just jump in on Yamisha's excellent reporting and interviews about this dynamic of Republicans who are telling journalists like Yamiche and maybe pollsters as well, what we heard Liz articulate in that interview with John Carl at ABC, that for her, it's not necessarily a policy election. It's about the future of the democracy. Talk about how that sort of changes or improves the coalition that Vice President Harris needs to prevail.
Sure, and I just want to put an emphasis on the historical nature of this. You know, the Republican Party was formed there in 1854, basically because the people that were anti-slavery had no room left. They felt they had no place left in their own party, and they had to start another party against, at that time, the Democrats and the Know Nothing Party. And so there's so many Republicans, as you know, that have felt no home anywhere. And they basically are doing something brand new, like the Republicans in 1854, and they're actually helping the opposing party. I mean, to me, this is akin to Barry Goldwater after the election in 1964, going in and working in the administration of LBJ. That's what this is akin to. A diehard conservative going to work for somebody that he was diametrically opposed to. To me, as I watch this unfold, there is actually three things that I think that are sort of strategically important about this. One, and you and I have had this conversation, I think all of these sort of things sends a signal, a permission structure to independents that basically says the Vice President Harris is not somebody you need to be afraid of. She's not somebody that's so radical that she's going to go off the deep end in this, that Liz Cheney sort of gives those independents a path to vote for her. The other thing are soft Republicans who may think it's a bridge too far to go and vote for the vice president, but actually may, because of this, skip the top of the ticket, not vote for. They don't like Donald Trump. They want to vote for a Republican, but maybe it's too far of a bridge to take to vote for the vice president. This may give them a chance. This may give them a message to basically say you can skip the top of the ticket. The other thing that I don't think has been talked about enough is in 2016 and in 2020, we talked endlessly about the hidden, quote, the hidden Trump vote that was not captured by polls in the end, that there was a couple of 1 or 2 points or a point and a half that people that were reluctant to say they were supporting him, but then voted for him. I actually believe that that hidden vote this time is the Vice President Harris vote, that Republicans who are reluctant to tell somebody on the phone that they're going to vote for a Democrat because they've been voting Republican their entire life, now may be in the confines of the ballot blindly, where nobody knows about it, will vote for her. And so to me, the odds are that the hidden vote this time is Harris Republican vote, not Donald Trump vote.
So, Matt,
we are going to turn to politics now, where there is new polling from the Cook Political Report finding Kamala Harris leading or tied with Donald Trump in all but one battleground state, all within the margin of error. And there's been some notable movement on some key issues. Joining us now with more on that, publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report, Amy Walter. So, Amy, what are the key issues you see movement on?
Yeah, Mika, what we saw just in the headline numbers, those top line numbers, not much change between August and September, really just barely on the margins. But on the issues of immigration and specifically the issue of inflation, Donald Trump's lead has either narrowed or, in the case of inflation, completely collapsed. So Trump had a 6-point lead on the issue of who do you think would do a better job controlling costs and inflation back in August. And today, the two candidates are even on that measure. And on immigration, it's still Trump's strongest issue, but it was an issue he had a double-digit lead on in August, and it's now down to a single-digit lead. The good news for Trump, though, is that for the people who are still undecided in this race or who say, you know, maybe I'm going to vote third party, they do see him by a pretty significant margin as being stronger on issues surrounding the economy. What is holding them back in many cases from voting for Donald Trump, and goes back to the conversation on your first panel, is Donald Trump's personal behavior. And so this is the pressure, the sort of cross pressure for these undecided voters about wanting to support Trump's policies, but not necessarily supporting Trump, the person.
So, Amy, this race, of course, couldn't be much closer. Your polling certainly reflects that. I do want to zero in on one state that is now listed as tied, and that may come as a surprise to some, because North Carolina, in the last few weeks, some Democrats really felt like they had a chance to build a bit of a lead because of the scandal and snarling the Republican gubernatorial candidate, Mark Robinson. And we know that Robinson's numbers have fallen in some polling, but at least here, it looks like he's not dragging down Trump at all.
That's a really good point, and that's right. And the Democratic candidate in that governor's race, part of the reason he's built such a big lead is that he's winning over about 20% of Trump voters. So there are plenty of voters in North Carolina now who are happy to split their ticket. They say, I'm sticking with Donald Trump, but I'm not voting for the Republican for governor. I'm going to vote for this Democrat. And I think that is something that in a state like North Carolina is going to be really important. But we are also seeing interesting this play out in other states, this interesting gap in a state like Arizona, where the Democratic candidate for the Senate, Ruben Gallego, building an even bigger lead over Kari Lake, Republican who ran for governor there in the last election, even as the race for president there incredibly close. So we may see more split ticket voting in this election than we're used to seeing, certainly used to seeing in the last couple of cycles.
Amy, wouldn't that mean both in Arizona and in North Carolina that the efforts of turnout, getting your solid base communities, districts to turn out at a higher level than expected could decide both states in terms of where the presidential vote goes? Because the operations on the ground, we don't see a lot from Trump in either state, and we do see some evidence of that with presidential candidate Harris. Wouldn't a ground operation have major impact?
Yeah, I think in a race that's this close, we're going to look back and point to probably 100 little things that made the difference between one candidate winning or losing. And it is true, if you go back to 2020, a lot of the frustration among Democrats that year was that they weren't able to do the on-the-ground organizing and the door-to-door campaigning because of COVID. And they're doing that now. The Trump campaign has outsourced a lot of their field operation to third parties, which means you don't have as much control over that. You don't know exactly what's happening and who they're targeting. The one thing we do know, though, at least from the last two elections, presidential elections, 2016 and 2020, is that Trump voters tend to turn out, whether they get their door knocked or not. And in many cases, it's not picked up in polling either. And so Trump's been successful in turning out his base, even if the campaign itself has not been as efficient as the Democrats have.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. We've been watching the scene in Ripon, Wisconsin. That is the birthplace of the Republican Party, shortly before the Civil War, before the election of Abraham Lincoln. And it's the place where former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney just joined Kamala Harris, vice president, for a joint campaign appearance. Taken to the stage amid chants of "Thank you, Liz," Cheney endorsed the vice president and laid out the stakes of this election.
I tell you, I have never voted for a Democrat. But this year, I am proudly casting my vote for Vice President Kamala Harris. As we meet here today, our republic faces a threat unlike any we have faced before. A former president who attempted to stay in power by unraveling the foundations of our republic, by refusing to accept the lawful results confirmed by dozens of courts of the 2020 election. We cannot turn away from this truth. In this election, putting patriotism ahead of partisanship is not an aspiration. It is our duty.
Now, to state the obvious, personally, I don't agree with a lot of Liz Cheney's politics. I imagine a lot of you watching feel the same way. In fact, I'd say basically I oppose just about everything she's advocated for in the course of her public life, except one thing. Except one thing. The most important thing. This is someone who put her whole political career, her future in the Republican Party, a party to which she was born, right? An heiress, in a sense. She put it all on the line for American democracy. She's someone who believes Donald Trump is a unique threat.
Donald Trump was willing to sacrifice our Capitol to allow law enforcement officers to be beaten and brutalized in his name and to violate the law and the Constitution in order to seize power for himself. I don't care if you are a Democrat or a Republican or an independent. That is depravity, and we must never become numb to it. Any person who would do these things can never be trusted with power again.
Now, the health and the future of American democracy is very clearly, obviously, on the ballot this election. But just because something is important, like whether we're going to be a democracy or not, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good campaign fodder. There is reason to believe, though, that just like 2 years ago, running on this core message, like we are Americans, we're a democracy and want to keep that going, that's a winning message. Take a look at this. This is a graph from 2022. The green line on this graph shows President Joe Biden's approval rating from the time he took office in January 2021 to September of 2022. You can see it was going pretty steadily down until the end of that summer, 2022, when it picks up and reverses course. You see that little just tick up in the bottom there? Now, this trend came in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision at the end of June overturning Roe v. Wade. Of course, over the course of June, July, millions of Americans also watched 8 hearings held by the January 6th committee. And so with the midterm elections approaching, President Biden Democrats saw where the mood of the country was, and they definitely ran on those issues, abortion and particular democracy. Remember that just ahead of Labor Day weekend, remember this speech? We took it live, I think. It was just ahead of Labor Day weekend, President Biden delivered this primetime address in front of Independence Hall, warning that our democracy was at stake.
For a long time, we've told ourselves that American democracy is guaranteed, but it's not. We have to defend it, protect it, stand up for it, each and every one of us. That's why tonight I'm asking our nation to come together, unite behind the single purpose of defending our democracy regardless of your ideology.
Now, remember, at the time, remember the discourse around this, right? It wasn't clear if that message was going to work. Sort of an open question. And there were a lot of people out there who thought that it was out of touch or tone deaf or even elitist, that real voters, real people, really only cared about grocery prices. And they were wrong. Biden and Democrats defied all the expectations. They pulled off a historic win for a still relatively unpopular incumbent president. The Democrats bet and won 2 years ago on the idea that it's actually condescending to think that ordinary people, plumbers and cab drivers and teachers and nurses, don't understand or care about democracy. What, that's too highfalutin for them? Of course, working people, people without a lot of money, people without formal education, they're smart. In fact, the reason we have a democracy in the first place is because we trust that all of us together can make these decisions. I think the majority of people of all different kinds of walks of life, all different levels of formal education, credentials, don't want a dictatorship. I think if you force the issue in those terms, the pro-democracy side wins. And that, again, that was the message, and it worked in 2022. So here we are again, 2 years later. This time around, the other side knows, believe me, they know, that January 6th, the images of the men bashing the cops' brains in, the attempt to overthrow the American Republic, is an enormous political liability. Instead of engaging with it or admitting to it, they are just desperately trying to run away from it.
Did he lose the 2020 election? Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
That is a damning non-answer. Republican House Majority Whip Tom Emmer from Minnesota, where Tim Walz is from, has been running around blaming the media. It's the media's fault for being obsessed with Donald Trump's attempted coup.
Did you think he'd get that question? Did you talk about how to answer the 2020 question?
Listen, this is, again, he answered it. You don't like the answer, but he answered it. This is something that you folks in the media want to focus on a regular basis. The American people, and thank goodness J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are focused on the election and how to fix this country. Again, Caitlin, we're talking about an election that's going to take place in 35 days. What are you doing talking about something that's 4 years ago? We can have this
Trump
debate
is still talking about it
some other time going forward. The people are hurting.
Okay, that's a tell, right? You don't have to, be particularly read into politics to understand the gentleman on the right of your screen doesn't want to talk about it because it's bad for him. Because the guy who's effectively his boss summoned a violent mob to try to end American democracy. So they want to change the subject because they understand, again, a majority of the country wants to preserve American democracy. Of course, Donald Trump himself is a bit of a different story. He is too obsessed with the whole thing to ever drop it.
It was a rigged election. You have to tell Kamala Harris, that's why I'm doing it again. If I thought I lost, I wouldn't be doing this again. You know where I'd be right now? On the beaches of Monte Carlo, maybe, or someplace. Be having a nice life.
All right, you see that little thing that we put up on the screen to let you know when that was? That was today. We're not running file footage. Today, in Saginaw, Michigan, a few days after Tom Emmer was yelling about how the media is obsessed with it, Donald Trump is talking about the 2020 rigged election. And there's a reason that has not worked for Trump. And it's while the pro-democracy message has been so salient. No matter our background, our income, our education level, our positions on things, I do think Americans believe, fundamentally, a majority of us, in our democratic experiment and want it to continue. So here we are, 33 days to go. Donald Trump and his authoritarian aims on the ballot once again. J.D. Vance pledging to do whatever it takes on Donald Trump's behalf, up to and including overturning elections. He's on the record with the help of the Supreme Court. Trump has tried to wipe his crimes against the country from voters' minds. And on the debate stage 2 days ago, his running mate, J.D. Vance, refused to tell tens of millions of Americans if he would help Donald Trump do it again. Just in the last 24 hours, we got new evidence from Special Prosecutor Jack Smith about how far Trump was willing to go to foment the coup on January 6th. And tonight, the birthplace of the Republican Party, Liz Cheney, stood up to remind us that he is really going to try to do it again. But if we come together as a pro-democracy coalition, we can stop it.
We have a shared commitment as Americans to ensuring that future generations live in a nation where power is transferred peacefully, where our leaders are men and women of good faith, and where our public servants set aside partisan battles to do what's right for this country. I ask you to meet this moment. I ask you to stand in truth, to reject the depraved cruelty of Donald Trump.
Now, I may live to eat these words. I don't know the future. No one else does. But I am willing to put my faith in the American people on this argument, that we want to be a democracy and not a Donald Trump dictatorship.
I want to bring in Andrew Weissmann, former FBI general counsel, former senior member of the Mueller probe, and an MSNBC legal analyst. Also with me, former Ohio Republican Governor John Kasich, who is an MSNBC political analyst, and NBC's Juan Hilliard with me here on set. Andrew, do you think Smith's argument is convincing enough to keep the charges against Trump intact?
What's remarkable here is that even with the Supreme Court ruling that knocked out all evidence that was plainly official conduct where it couldn't be rebutted to show that it was being taken on behalf of a candidate, there still is just unbelievably strong evidence. My takeaway from this brief is that obviously if Donald Trump is not elected president. And so he, because obviously if he wins the election, he will just have his Department of Justice dismiss this case. But if he is not elected, this case is going to go forward. The level and quantity of proof from all sorts of sources, mostly from within his own campaign and his own lawyers, up to and including his own vice presidential candidate, is replete. So there's very, very strong evidence that's recounted in this compendium that was put forth by Jack Smith.
So let me get a little more specific, if I can, Andrew. The filing has details about what Trump himself supposedly said. For example, he told family members, quote, "It doesn't matter if you won or lost the election. You still have to fight like hell." What's the value of including statements like that?
So what is different in this brief that we didn't have as much in the January 6th committee hearings is direct statements, direct evidence with people who were speaking to the president and also heard what the president had to say. So you have direct admissions. And there's sort of two pieces to that. One, it's plain that he is speaking as a candidate. And frankly, for all of the viewers out there, of course he is. He was interested in being reelected. That was his primary motivation. And that was the reason he did a whole slew of things. One really interesting, lovely vignette as to that is in a really important meeting with Rudy Giuliani, who was acting as his private counsel. Donald Trump kicked his White House counsel, his official counsel for the White House, out of the meeting. So if there's anything that indicates that this is a private discussion, not an official discussion, that's just a wonderful vignette that Jack Smith latches onto. So here you have both really strong evidence that the president was acting as a candidate to try and to win the election in spite of the fact that the votes were against him. That's the criminal conspiracy. And you have really strong evidence, if and when this goes to trial, of his mens rea, that is his mental state, that he was aware in the clip that you just noted that he didn't care whether he won or lost. He was going to say that there was fraud. It didn't matter what the facts were. And that is the Donald Trump that we all know very well. Facts do not matter in sort of Earth 2.
So, Governor, a couple of other examples. The filing describes Trump being told on January 6th that Mike Pence had to be evacuated, and Trump's response was, "So what?" Pence himself told Trump at least 5 times there's no evidence of voter fraud. I mean, the details are new, but this is, frankly, the Donald Trump most Americans already know. So politically speaking, and I'm really interested in those middle-of-the-road voters who may still go either way, does this move the needle?
Perhaps a little bit, Chris, but look, people are dug in, and there are going to be Republicans that are going to say, hey, this was an October surprise that dropped on him in order to change this election, and it could fire up some of the Trump base. And then on the other side, the Democrats are going to be saying, well, you see, we told you so. Where does it come out? It may come out, marginally against Trump, but I'm not sure. But when we talk about October surprises, Chris, there's a couple things going on right now that could be labeled as an October surprise. And one of them is the strike that's going on, the port strike. And you could begin to see prices dramatically ramp up. I heard this morning that there are people now that are going to these stores, these big box stores with pallets, trying to take all their stuff out of there because they're afraid there'll be shortages. And, of course, we don't know what's going to happen exactly to prices, but they're not going to go down. They're going to go up. Is that an October surprise? How about what's happening in the Middle East? I mean, there's so much that's changing over there, and not just the invasion of Lebanon, but Gaza, the West Bank, what's going to happen vis-a-vis Iran. I mean, there is another thing that could come as an October surprise. And then thirdly, how about the storm? What's happening in North Carolina? Are people getting the help that they need? What's going to happen with insurance prices? So there are many things in this crazy election year floating around that could be an October surprise, and this is just one of them. What's going to have the biggest impact? Hold on, we're going to have to see.
Yeah, buckle up. So, Vaughn, he's right. I mean, we were talking about this triple threat. Now you have this added in. What's the former president saying about this?
His social media account would tell you that it's at the forefront of his mind. For Donald Trump, this is an issue that has continued to follow him for the last 3.5 years. But let's be very clear here. Donald Trump continues to claim that he won the 2020 election. As late as 2022, he was still calling for a redo of the 2020 election. Just take a listen to him last night in response to this redacted brief being released.
This was a weaponization of government, and that's why it was released 30 days before the election. And it's nothing new in there, by the way, nothing new. They rigged the election. I didn't rig the election. They rigged the election.
To be clear, the D.C. federal judge, Judge Chutkan, is the one who decided to release this 100%. Redacted filing. His attorneys, as the judicial system will play out, have the opportunity to file their own response over the next 2 weeks. They've requested 5 weeks to do that to the Jack Smith immunity briefing that it was just filed and released publicly yesterday. So they will have the opportunity to do that. But for the American public, this is going to come down to Election Day. And whether this case will ever see the light of day, even if Judge Chutkan rules that some of the conversations that he had with Vice President Pence are immune, and even if some of these specific charges were to be tossed, this for the American public is going to be a decision on November 5th of whether this federal election interference case will go forward come 2025, 2026. Because as you heard, Donald Trump is making the very case that the fact that this case is proceeding in real time amounts to election interference in its own self. Of course, the charges against him are for federal election interference.
Andrew, what do you think the chances are that Trump's team gets this extension?
I think probably pretty good. This is a very lengthy brief, and I think that Judge Chutkan, remember, she comes from a defense background as a federal defender, and she has been very fair. And before she makes any ruling, she hears from both sides. So I think that, maybe she won't give them all of that time, but I wouldn't be surprised if she does. She is not trying to get things done before the election. She has just got a mandate from the Supreme Court as to what she has to do. And she is sticking to that. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're given more time, just given the length of the submission. It's interesting because you would think Donald Trump, if he really thought that he had either factual evidence or legal arguments to be made, that he'd want to get that in before the election, just as a political matter, so that his version would get out. But he fought tooth and nail to not have the submission that was filed yesterday ever see the light of day. And I think now that we have seen it, we understand why. Final point on this, the evidence here is coming from his own people. It's really important to remember that to sort of lay this on Jack Smith is really not fair, because he is recounting what people said who were up to and including Donald Trump's own vice president. So the source of this information are Republican loyalists to Donald Trump, and that's where the information is coming from.
Yeah, speak to that part of it, Governor. I mean, again, I go back to his base is his base. Kamala Harris's supporters are Kamala Harris's supporters. We're looking at, depending who you talk to, anywhere from 2 to maybe 9% of the population that may still be willing to go one way or another. The fact that all of these examples come from people who were within his circle, all the way up to Vice President Mike Pence, does it have an impact there?
Well, look, again, I think, as to these undecided people, they're going to look at this. But as I mentioned, these other issues, what the heck is happening with the strike? Do all of a sudden do they get impacted in the store when they go in to try to buy something and the prices have gone through the roof? Because I've told you earlier, I think people care most about the pocketbook and also about the economy. Here's the issue, I think. Here's the issue, Chris, I think makes sense. There is great intensity among the Trump supporters. However, the amount of Republicans that would stay away from supporting Trump is pretty significant. Maybe it's 15%. When it comes to Harris, people may not be as dedicated to her as she would like, but at the same time, Democrats are going to vote. So you're going to have more Democrats getting to the polls and supporting their nominee than Donald Trump is. And so that has an impact in and of itself before we even think about the people who are undecided. Put it all together, flip a coin, but, the momentum is with Harris. But it's still early. It's early October. We got a whole month to go, Chris.
In an interview he gave with News Nation last night, former President Donald Trump said that if he wins in November, he would revoke the temporary protected status granted to Haitian migrants in Springfield, Ohio.
In Springfield, what's happening there is horrible. You have a beautiful community, 52,000 people, and about 30,000 people were put into that community rapidly, and the community is so nice and they want to be so politically correct. You have to remove the people. We cannot destroy our country. You had a beautiful, safe community. Everyone's in love with everybody. Everything was nice. It was like a picture community. And all of a sudden, in a short period of time, they have 32,000 more people in there. They are, in my opinion, it's not legal. It's not legal for anybody to do. It's not even on a human basis. It's not acceptable to the people that are there, and certainly to the people that are in Springfield. Springfield is such a beautiful place. Have you seen what's happened to it? It's been overrun. You can't do that to people. They have to be removed.
Let's be clear what this is. Trump is saying he's going to deport legal immigrants. Joining us now, MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle. Mike, thanks for being here. So let's talk about Trump's rhetoric on immigration. I mean, most of what he said there is simply not true. And despite being told by fellow Republicans, including the Republican governor of Ohio, he just will not let up his relentless and frankly racist bashing of these immigrants.
When we were showing that clip that we just saw and listened to it, it causes me again to wonder how many Americans are out there who are going to shrug their shoulders and say, you know what, I'm exhausted. This guy is exhausting me. This guy has been impeached twice. This guy has been adjudicated a rapist by a New York judge. This guy is a felon. He's got 5 or 6 felony counts against him. This guy cannot tell the truth. This guy twists everything, a reality, into something of his own concoction. I can't do it anymore. I'm not going to vote for him. I voted for him in 16, or say they voted for him in 20. How many Americans are out there saying, no, I want to talk about my children going forward, their schools, the safety of the schools. I want to talk about grocery prices. I want to talk about gas prices. I do not want to listen to him.
I mean, I think the exhaustion factor is real, and certainly the Harris campaign hopes it permeates the ballot box. At the same time, polls suggest that nearly half the country is still on board with this, and that Donald Trump has a 1 in 2 chance of winning. What does that say about who we are?
Well, that's a great question, Jonathan. And I keep thinking that, 10, 20 years from now, when historians try to capture this period of time politically and culturally, what happened in this country, they're going to look at what has happened and what is happening right in front of us, in front of all of us right now. And they're saying, what was wrong with those people? What that they did not see? What did they did not recognize?
It's such an indictment. Let's move. Speaking of potential indictments, let's talk about Jack Smith. Yesterday, unsealing a filing that had a lot of new details about Trump's conduct on his efforts to overturn the 2020 election and his conduct on January 6th, particularly when it comes to Mike Pence, when he seemed that he was completely unmoved that his vice president's life was in danger. Does this qualify as an October surprise?
No, I don't think so. I think it qualifies as recognizing that Judge Chutkan is saying to the Supreme Court, take this. No one agrees with the ruling that you people concocted that declared that no president, every president has immunity from nearly everything. Take this. And it's just a kernel of what Jack Smith has found, apparently. I don't know whether it has an impact or not. I don't think it's the October surprise. I think the big October surprise is going to happen out of the Middle East.
Yeah, let's revisit that in just a second. On this, there's also an unnamed Trump campaign staffer who even said, make them riot, when there was some disturbances at a local campaign office. How much, if you were counseling the Harris campaign right now, how much would January 6th, Defense of Democracy, be one of your closing arguments. It worked for the Democrats in both 2020 and in 2022. President Biden drove that. Do you think it still will this time around?
Yeah, I do. I do, because I think every day he will give you something else. Trump will give you something else. He'll give you another gift in terms of running against him. Depends on how the vice president packages it.
Okay, so let's go back to the Middle East. You know, we're sort of awaiting what Israel's response will be to the Iranian attack of earlier this week. It is Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year's, the sense that maybe it'll wait till after that. How big, you sort of alluded to it, that this could be something that changes the calculation here domestically. Do you think that's what Prime Minister Netanyahu has in mind?
Given his behavior towards this administration, both outwardly and what you hear, what you certainly hear in Washington from people, what you pick up in terms of sources talking about the relationship between Netanyahu and the president, President Biden, yeah, I think Netanyahu has it in his mind that we're going to attack Iran. We're going to wipe out their oil refineries, which will cause gas prices to jump up here in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And I don't care what Joe Biden thinks. Now, that's what he thinks, okay? But when you look at it on paper, you've got to ask yourself, realistically, seriously, his country was attacked by a next-door neighbor. If we were attacked, we would strike back very, very, very hard. I mean, I would hope we would. That's what the Israelis are doing, and it's a tough balance, I think, to figure out both emotionally and politically for the United States of America.
And we'll have live reporting from the Middle East in just a moment on Morning Joe. And we'll see you on Morning Joe
really?
As well. Yeah,
You're going to ask me on?
You have to stay. It was a good booking for us. And